Hello and greetings from the University of Notre Dame Press. My name is Jake Kildoo and I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at the Press. We're really happy to be here today with our Books for Better Understanding author event series. Today's featured author is Thomas R. Parker, whose book, American Presidents in Diplomacy and War, Statecraft, Foreign Policy, and Leadership, was published this month by Notre Dame Press. Today, Tom and I will spend some time discussing his project. But before we get started, let me take a moment to introduce our guest more fully. Thomas R. Parker is a professorial lecturer at George Washington University and author of The Road to Camp David. He worked for 30 years in diplomatic and military affairs for the White House, U.S. Defense Department, State Department, and the intelligence community. Welcome, Tom, and thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Jake. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Yeah, likewise. Great, so let's go ahead and get started. Tom, could you talk a bit about some of the overarching themes of your book? That is, what is it that makes for successful foreign policy after all?
Well, thanks very much for the question. I think it has to do a lot with personality. And I think that the individuals who tend to be more successful are people who can analyze a situation in a dispassionate way and not let their emotions let them be carried away. And then they can go through a series of options on any given subject and choose a reasonably good one. Then a second part of, I think, what makes for successful statecraft, because it's not just an intellectual exercise like something I just described, but it's, seeing through a policy. And there it becomes maybe a little less analytical and a little more with an emphasis on determination, attention to detail. And so there's kind of two prongs there, I think, in which you analyze situations and then you move forward once you've decided what to do in a determined way, sometimes in an implacable way, to see a policy through. So I think those are kind of two somewhat different the aspects of personality that are needed to be successful.
Right, so maybe sort of a theory and then a practice component.
Yeah, not it doesn't have to be so theoretical as that's kind of from the academic world, but it has to be dispassionate and thorough and prudent in the sense of looking at all sides of the issue. There's a nice quote from Edmund Burke, who was the British parliamentarian back in the late 1700s, which I used. He warned about the dangers of the violence in the French Revolution. And he said, prudence is the god of this lower world. Prudence is the god of this lower world. And what he meant by that is not excessive caution, but just being wary and looking at a given issue and trying to parse it in all its various aspects.
Right. Yeah, that makes great sense. Great, so I want to turn to some of the particular presidents that you deal with in the book. You start with Washington and Hamilton, and you end up comparing them to Jefferson and Madison. What do you suppose Washington and Hamilton did well, and why do you rank them above Jefferson and Madison ultimately?
Thanks for the question. It's a good one. I think Washington and Hamilton, they had a better sense of the power politics of the era. It didn't come automatically in the sense that Washington's an interesting figure in that he initially, at least on the battlefield, I'm talking about military actions rather than diplomacy, he had a strong will. And he had to in order to succeed, but initially was almost willful. And he initially refused to fight kind of insurgency warfare against the British. and which is what was needed, and it was what his advisors were telling him to do. You can't go up against the British, who are better trained and maybe more numerous even. You have the kind of insurgency warfare. He refused to do that initially. He got decisively defeated in battle in the Battle of Long Island in 1776, shortly after the Declaration of Independence. And it was only reluctantly did he come around to fighting a more prudent way, insurgency by almost insurgency, but sometimes conventional warfare too. So he learned from his initial mistakes. And in diplomacy, he was, along with Hamilton, and they were really intellectually, I think, very close. He was cautious. He didn't, to be concrete, for example, he didn't throw himself and the country into the arms of the French after the French offered to help to fight against the British during the Revolutionary War. And he said, because Lafayette was urging him to invite the French back into North America, he said, no, let's not do that, because at the end of the day, they're friends of us now, but 10 years ago we were fighting them, and 10 years from now maybe we'll be fighting them again. But he didn't let himself get carried away by emotions when it came to his diplomacy, and Hamilton was the same way. So what did all that mean? In the 1790s, when war breaks out, this is after American independence, and the war breaks out between France and Britain in the wake of the French Revolution, there were some pushing for aligning ourselves with the French, like Jefferson, who was kind of very much a Francophile. And Washington and Hamilton said, no, you shouldn't do this. Let's not get involved with something where our interests are not really at stake. And so they kept a more neutral approach, which I think was the right one. They were just, I think, more dispassionate when it came to analyzing, the geopolitical situation. Jefferson, and then also his close friend Madison, they were, I think, less that way. They were maybe less comfortable with power. They came from a large agricultural state, Virginia, which in some ways was quite wary of federal power. And I think it made them wary of power in general. And they were not gung-ho, for example, on a strong American defense establishment, because they were, at the end of the day, they were afraid it might be turned against their own state, I suppose. And so they took an approach during the 1790s, the early 1800s, of being aggressively countering the harassment of the British of our ships trying to trade with Europe, but they didn't build up a defense establishment. So in doing so, I think in some ways they stumbled into the War of 1812, which I think was an unnecessary war. Now Washington and Hamilton were gone from the scene by then, but I think it was one of those wars that could have ended in disaster, because it threatened the union of the states, and New England was against the war. So I think they were imprudent in that sense.
Right. Yeah, that was an excellent case study at showing the importance of prudence and caution, no doubt.
I'd like to think so, yeah.
Great. So in the book, you write about Abraham Lincoln as well, and the importance of diplomacy in the Civil War, which is interesting because you don't hear much about this topic, since the military component was sort of all-consuming. How important was the diplomatic component?
The diplomacy was, let me just get this, it was important. It was less important than the war, of course, which is why it's understudied. But you didn't want to make any mistakes in the diplomacy of the Civil War. because the British and the French wanted to intervene on the side of the Confederacy. And Lincoln fairly quickly understood that. And so there was one occasion in particular at the end of 1861, it's called the Trent Affair, when the British were sending their mails, I think, between the Caribbean, Canada, I think, and back to Europe. And they had two Confederate diplomats on the ships, which were going to Europe to represent the Confederacy. They were stopped by a U.S. northern state captain of a northern ship. And this was very popular within the North because we kind of, stuck it to the Confederacy. But it caused a big row back in England, where they felt probably correctly that they had the right to innocent passages across the Atlantic. And that was a fairly tense time. And if Lincoln hadn't kind of, given way and just kind of let the confrontation peter out, there might have been a situation where the British were going to push for military intervention, which is something they were kind of intrigued by anyway, because they had a lot of economic ties with the South, the cotton trade. It fed their mills in the English Midlands. So they were taking a hit because of the American Civil War. So this was a chance that they might try to open up that trade again by military intervention. And Lincoln, he wasn't goaded by public opinion. He said, let's let this, confrontation kind of, peter out. So it was a situation which could have turned very badly for the North, but it didn't, thanks to Lincoln not being overwhelmed by the emotions of the present. I think that's another takeaway from the book, is that leader is buffeted by strong public opinion and emotion, and which may or may not be right in terms of policy. It's not automatically wrong, of course, but you should kind of take a deep breath, step back, see the big picture, and not get pushed into any one direction by public opinion, which tends to be pretty ephemeral in its manifestations.
Right.
And that's what Lincoln did in that case. And he kept the North out of any full bore confrontation with the British during that whole time, which was the right policy. And his Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, didn't feel that way. And he said, let's stick it to the British if they're being difficult with us. But, I think Lincoln wisely said at one point, one war at a time. So, again, it's not a spectacular story, the diplomacy of the American Civil War, because nothing terrible happened, but that's the way you'd want it to be. Right. Nothing terrible to happen.
Right.
So,
yeah, it's illustrative. That's a great instance of the importance of being dispassionate, as you know.
Right. Just and letting the temporary storms kind of blow on by.
Great. Well, Tom, I want to turn to another towering presidential figure that you write about. That's Teddy Roosevelt.
Okay.
Wasn't he a rather aggressive guy before he became president? What was he like after he became president?
Well, right, you put your finger on it. Roosevelt was the youngest president, man to become president, I think, until maybe John Kennedy. He became president, in the early 20s, in his early 40s, after the assassination of McKinley in 1901, I think. As a young man in his 20s and his 30s, he was a very aggressive person. Someone described him as a walking battering ram. He was extremely forceful. He was interested in military affairs. There's an interesting story about him where he was at Harvard and he wanted to write his dissertation, I think his honors dissertation, on the naval warfare of the War of 1812. And he was told, no, you can't do that because we don't do military history here. So you can do what you want, but you're not going to get your honors degree. And he said, well, I don't care. I'm going to do it anyway. So he wrote the book about the naval aspects of the War of 1812, and it became a big hit. I hope the same thing can be said of my book. It was in the 1880s. So as a young man, he puts his name on the map as a defense intellectual. And he is hawkish. There's no doubt about it. He wants to, let's see, he's born in, I think, 57. So he's coming of age now in the 1880s. This was in some ways the height of European power. You know, it's going into Africa and partitioning Africa. And there's some thought of maybe they do the same thing in China. And so it was a kind of expansionistic age. And, you know, America was kind of not directly involved, but it was, you know, part of that whole era, I think. And he partook of it. And he was, for example, you know, very much in favor of taking over the Philippines in the Spanish-American War of 1898. And as we all know, he resigned from the Naval Department in order to fight in the Spanish-American War and, you know, climb up San Juan Hill, and made a big name for himself. Even though he had been warned that, you know, don't leave this cushy job and with the U.S. Navy in Washington. But he did, and it turned out right for him. So he's chosen to become president, I guess largely or partly because he's from New York State. It's a big state then. And then he becomes president in 1901. But starting around then, so he's in his early 40s, he does become a little, you know, more sophisticated. He doesn't. He's cautious about what America can do. He comes to even regret taking over the Philippines because he realizes, as president, that they're probably going to be very, very difficult to defend against Japan, because Japan is on the rise at that same time. And he genuinely regrets having taken them over towards the end of his presidential period in power. But what else does he do as president? Well, he wins the Nobel Peace Prize, as we know, as a mediator between Russia and Japan in the 1904-1905 Russo-Japanese War. And he does a very good job that way. He understands the parties. He gets to know their diplomats. He went to Harvard, I think, with the Japanese foreign minister, so he had a good entree right then. And he demonstrates a real skill in building bridges, telling each party what they can expect, but what they can't expect from the other. And he helps to achieve a peace there, which was important, because if that war had gone on, maybe the Tsarist regime would have fallen, as it eventually did because of World War I. But it was, you know, time to put that war, you know, under wraps, and he helped to do that. So that was impressive. And another impressive bit of diplomacy, where he also played a mediating role, was with the Germany in the Moroccan crisis in 1905, I believe. It wasn't. Now, it's not a household incident, to say the least. But there again, the Germans under the Kaiser were challenging the diplomatic status quo in North Africa and Morocco, and specifically. There was mobilization by the French. I mean, who knows what could have happened there. But Roosevelt, there again, played a very useful role as mediator, kind of behind the scenes, cajoling the Kaiser, praising him, threatening him, because he had some letters from the German ambassador here saying that Germany would do certain things. Roosevelt threatened to make them public in a kind of, diplomatic way. And he was successful there too. So the bottom line, I think, this is someone who, like Washington, matured over time, and he played a very successful role as mediator. And then the final thing I'll say about him is that he was very big on the American military, particularly the Navy, and without being belligerent. So he built up the U.S. Navy, I think from, it was negligible Navy, and then under his tutorship, it became the second or third largest in the world, I think. And he said, we may have heard of the Great White Fleet. The ships were painted white back then. They sailed around the world. So why did that happen? It happened in large part as a warning, diplomatic warning to Japan. Japan had won that war more or less against the Russians. And Roosevelt was afraid that the victory was going to their head, which to some degree it did. And he sent the White Fleet around the world, stopping in Japan, and as a subtle warning about the American power in the Pacific. And it went well. He said, when you land in Japan, I want the utmost civility to be the word of order. And it was. Partly, as a result of all that, the Japanese sent some cherry trees to Washington, D.C., which we've all heard about. Well, it was partly their wanting to have good relations with the United States. And I think partly, and I think Roosevelt was part of all that. So he did, I think, an exceptionally good job. And if you read his letters, he really does think about these issues in a very thoughtful way. In fact, he even said at some point in his letters, this is, I think, as president, or at least before World War I, he said, I could see a scenario where Germany is the most immediate threat, and there might even be a war involving Germany. But if there were, you might even see a German defeat, in which case they reach out to the West, because then the greatest danger is from Russia. So he, in effect, is foreseeing, what happens in the 20th century. So that's impressive.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Great. Well, Tom, in the book, you argue, this is one of my favorite of your arguments, you argue that guile, which you distinguish, interestingly, from sort of deceitfulness or something like that, you argue that guile can be really an important factor in successful statecraft, and that leaders like Franklin Roosevelt embodied this sort of quality. Can you elaborate a little bit on what exactly this quality is and how people like Roosevelt put it to work?
Sure. Guile involves obviously not, playing your hand out in the open, and you have to make a calculation about exactly, how much you're going to show of what you want, and you don't want to overdo that, because if you get a reputation of being, a slippery character whose word means nothing, you're not going to be successful. So it has to be, I think, used strategically. In other words, thoughtfully and for long-term purposes. I thought Franklin Roosevelt was a good example of that. This is before the the war breaks out. I don't really go into much what happens during the war. That's a very interesting subject in itself. But before the war breaks out, during the 1930s, we see a man who he doesn't want to take America into any war, which doesn't really break out until 39, but he wants America to be ready. And so he gradually provides support for the British and the French, and after the French are defeated in 1940, just the British. And he's a tremendously disciplined human being. Maybe not the most likable person in the world, because he's very crafty, and he's uses people to suit his purposes, maybe even more than most politicians. But what he does during the 30s is he gradually brings the United States along without telling the voters that, to help the British and the French as much as the traffic would bear, as much as the American public would support that. So he's always a bit out in front of public opinion, but not too far out in front. In some ways, he probably would have he did a better job than, say, Theodore Roosevelt would have done, who was, he could also master his emotions too, but still, he couldn't hide them all the time.
Right.
Whereas Franklin Roosevelt really could and did. So if you look at chapter I did on Roosevelt, you see how he brought the country along, helped the British and the French. And so when war broke out involving the United States, the US would be ready for it as much as it could be. And he provided as much military support as he could for the British and the French, and particularly the British after the French, were defeated. That was a very tense time, that period between the French defeat in May of 1940, June, and then the German invasion of Russia a year later. But there was that period of year where the British were all alone, and FDR provided them as much support as he could. And so they always would have wanted more, but he was, I think he did as much as he could, given the nature of public opinion.
Great. Well, I want to zoom out just a little bit now and
Yeah.
ask about the audience of your book. Who do you
Yes.
think will benefit most from reading a book like this?
Right. I think people who are interested in foreign policy and American history. I don't go into the domestic policies of these presidents. If you want a kind of concise encapsulation of these iconic presidents, I'm thinking mainly of Washington and parenthetically Hamilton, and then Lincoln and the two Roosevelts. To me, it's a good analysis of why they were successful, what made for their successful statecraft. So if you're interested, in those presidents and plus some of the succeeding ones, I think that would be of interest. And secondly, if you're interested in foreign policy, successful foreign policy in general, I try to put them in a broader context. So you could read the book and then say, I want to find out more about their foreign policies, and you can read entire books on that. And then B, this gives me a pretty good viewpoint on what makes for a successful foreign policy. That's why I like that word statecraft, because it implies a kind of canny understanding of what's at stake and what to do. And so, you can go on to your readings of diplomatic and military history, and keeping some of the kind of general lessons and precepts from the book in mind. So I think it's tried to focus on where these leaders had to make key decisions and what they were and how they made those decisions.
Right, right. Great. Well, unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our
Sure,
time.
sure.
I wonder if you have any brief closing comments on just broadly the importance of your book in a time like now.
Well, thanks very much, Jake. I appreciate it. Um, it's, these, I can't pretend that it's any more important now than it would have been 50 years ago or 50 years hence. And there are other great books out there, God knows. And I think it's important to understand history and maybe make it relevant to the present. There's a danger, I think, I see it a bit in my students sometimes, of being overwhelmed by the present, overwhelmed by social media, spending, inordinate amounts of time on social media. Well, this is a pretty concise book, but I think I did a lot of reading, and including original sources. So I think you can, 3 cheers for books. That's all we can say, I think.
Right.
Or we'll make it 4.
No doubt.
That's, that's been our past, and it should be our present and future too.
Excellent. Great. Well, I want to thank you, Tom, for
Okay.
participating, being here today with us. It's
Sure.
been a really interesting and insightful discussion. And I want to
Great.
thank you, too, for your excellent book, American Presidents in Diplomacy and War. It's available this month wherever books are sold. And we want to encourage our viewers to visit and support your local independent bookstore, either in person or online, or you can order the book through the Notre Dame Press website at undpress.nd.edu. Thank you for joining us.